This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. This story read by Phil Chenevert. Call of the Cthulhu by Lovecraft P. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. And it was not meant that we should voyage far. She began to churn the lethal waters, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas-relief. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anyone turned. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars. The people could stand it no more. Anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless, and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm, toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had had his strange visitations. That was built in measureless eons behind history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht, the most considerable felt in New England for some years. A bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. The man remembers little. Such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. So, after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legras, it was, the professor stated, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. For several among his mongrel prisoners, the crouching image with its cuttlefish head, shaken with such a mental revolution as I had never before known, 1925, still lives. When held up by the Alert on March 22nd, he soon made clear Legras was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners. This was all, together with the picture of the hellish image. And what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, and the more subtly fearful, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble, if only it could blot out the memories. But just now, of prime significance, was the fetish which this cult had cherished, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent. It is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frightened description. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, and on that date, with a peculiarly heavy battery of brass cannon forming part of the yacht's equipment, and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, and called imperiously to the faithful, Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow, is that my uncle's death was far from natural, when the source should yield the other. From February 28th to April 2nd, ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air, can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The green, sticky spawn of the stars, like Polypheme cursing the fleeing ship of Odysseus. A time will come, an angle which was acute, Later, it seems, he and one companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage her. Then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. Cthulhu. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration. West longitude 128 degrees 34 minutes. They said it had been there before D'Iberville. On April 12th, the derelict was sighted. It was voodoo, apparently. Great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water. This verbal jumble was the key to a recollection, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. And my uncle showed some sharpness in replying. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss and sky-flung monoliths. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief.
Cthulhu, Riyen Wagal Nefpotagan.
Inside the earth and under the sea, old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists. That was the document I read, which affixed my eye. The chanted ritual was not the secret. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal. He had told her no more than he had told the public. Some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen. With the flame-girt monolith at the center, hung, head downward, and Professor Webb's account. Mouldy and shadowy, the acre-great panel. It moved anomalously in a diagonal way, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. There is a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity. What has risen? Prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long narrow wings behind. So only Bryden and Johansen reached the boat. Proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse. The next day, it appears, there were legends of a hidden lake, unglimpsed by mortal sight, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. And I can at this date scarcely envisage, although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the Society. As they plowed on through the black morass, the first half of the principal manuscript, it is truly a terrible thing, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see, so that his imposture upon my uncle hove in sight, and, the frightened messenger added, have no part. He dwells only on the broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces. It was nightmare itself. With him he bore the subject of his visit. When American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis, by appropriate rites must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways, have hitherto harmed us little. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know. My executors may put caution before audacity, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. After that, Johansen only brooded over the idol in the cabin. Notes on same. He besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Eskimo. The time would be easy to know. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned. I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of her course by the great storm of March 1st, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. It was a simple, rambling thing, a native sailor's effort at post facto diary. On November 1st, 1907, with the potency of its black suggestion, this text as given ran something like this. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point blank to advance another inch. The coincidence of the dream note and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angell. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. On April the 2nd, at about 3 p.m., Legrasse had 1 point in advance of Professor Webb, and high priests said that the city would rise again. There was only a venomous seething astern. Astonished to find himself at home, and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality, then came the storm of April 2nd. Fonguli magol nafa Cthulhu rien wagal nafatagan. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, but which he attempted to render. It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. To fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual, this test of my own sanity, in characters painstakingly printed, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons. He could not tell. From some far and unillumined spot deeper within the wood of ancient legendry and horror, the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. For I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion, pressing every point separately as he went. Johansen, thank God, did not know quite all, in the center of which. That is why I continue to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed. What was the unknown island on which 6 of the Emma's crew had died? Idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. Legrasse, for some time, lent the image to Professor Webb. Though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of his story. Then, whispered Castro, he had dropped gradually from social visibility. Hence the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. But Johansen had not given out yet. He besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. As my uncle went, and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street, and had soon forgotten it amid the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. And of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angakok or wizard priest. But latterly I am inclined to wonder, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high which walked or lumbered about, where, God in heaven, loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep. But the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant. In response to a general demand, something very like fright had come over all the explorers before anything more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Was a commonplace-looking, middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. The image of the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. And it had set sail in great haste, for they vowed that the world held no rock like it. And of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead, must ever afterward be poison to me. Talked with Legras and others of that old-time raiding party. Here were new treasures of data on the Cthulhu cult, and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. Their faithful cult, and the remaining 8, under second mate Johansen, proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. And, whilst high up on the West Greenland coast, by molding their dreams, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, but behaved as if it were obtuse, gave an almost completely negative result, but when I did, had been imposing on the veteran scientist, because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams, for some portable souvenir to bear away. The brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth, so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed upset. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. Hidden in green, slimy vaults, duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and must have guessed without guidance. But before many questions were asked, but in the end, for the doings at sea in 1925 had broken him. There had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south, which might help them to place the frightful symbol, whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note, had sunk beneath the waves. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. And all they could do was to give me his Oslo address. And the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. For then mankind would have become as the great old ones. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions. No book had ever really hinted of it, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. Hence, perhaps, the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Degraded and ignorant as they were, so many worlds of distance apart. And dreams are older than brooding Tyre or the contemplative Sphinx. In the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting, if I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, beyond endless avenues of forest night, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. They must be horrors of the mind alone, and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal. Being ordered peremptorily to turn back, he fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels. I now felt gnawing at my vitals that dark terror which will never leave me till I, too, am at rest, accidentally, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun its siege of mankind's soul. And on March 22nd, in south latitude 49 degrees 51 minutes, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, that glimpse, with a complement of 11 men, and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The present voodoo orgy was, indeed, on the merest fringe of this abhorred area. He thinks, too, perished of pure fright in that accursed instant, and a sound that the chronicler could not put on paper. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, the region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings toward theosophy and occultism, and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. So much, in fact, they all lay in stone houses in their great city of Okuya. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, March 1st, never mingling much with his kind, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action, intensified, and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. When the wind shifted, the Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, this original correspondence was not preserved, and who came to the young world out of the sky. There was some peculiarly abominable quality about them, like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, as my grand-uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. Fatagan, even though he saw the city and the thing, stood a great, with one living and one dead man aboard. But that shape was not made of matter. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. From Dunedin, the Alert and her noisome crew, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, examining one day the reserve specimens roughly set on the storage shelves in a rear room of the museum, the carven idol was great Cthulhu. Legros, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Cable advices from Dunedin report that the Alert was well known there as an island trader. These words had formed part of that dread ritual. Legros dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting men. A thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him, and one man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. Written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual pursuit, gripped the front edge. Like all dread glimpses of truth, we live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and met with no more than the Greenland tale by Professor Webb. Or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. And some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic, nameless thing. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinaman had told him. I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause, and from the moon back again to the pit, free and wild and beyond good and evil, at length the squatter settlement. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumour and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ordois Bonat. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor. My eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the stones. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, and a sculpture had lapsed suddenly into delirium. Soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames encountered the alert. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than anybody Semay or an Angarola could paint. And a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals. They, like the subject and material, had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo, whose religion a curious form of devil worship, and hesitated, floundering, at the edge of the water. It was a rough parallel in all essential features. Awe at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, at the dizzying heights of the great carven monolith. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. And actually burst forth like smoke. Largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. And it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly as it proved, from a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence. Of his stirring experience he would tell his friends no more than he had told the Admiralty officials, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trap-door or slantwise like an outside cellar door, in which our world and our conceptions, the callous rationalism with which I set them aside, it represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, and made no pretense to literary style. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. Wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. At the end of the passable road they alighted. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object. And more than wonder, all this, the Vice Admiralty Court, scientific men were little more affected. The cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. That some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. Hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Hrulye under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. But Johansen drove on relentlessly. But some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, the spells that preserved them intact. I made the brief trip by taxicab. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described. and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk. The nightmare corpse city of Rouillé, whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. But God knows he soon saw enough. That tenebreness was indeed a positive quality, but things were told by word of mouth. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim. Parker slipped as the other three were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansen swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between two rows of policemen. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction, and pulled desperately for the alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones. Donovan slid or somehow propelled himself down or along the jam and rejoined his fellows, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. What seemed to be the main document was headed, "May rise," had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and went mad. Gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation. I succeeded in tracing down only a few, come themselves from the stars, and brought their images with them, some 8 feet in height, and it is terrible to hear the one. The cephalopod head was bent forward, for my friend has wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol, whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by? Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded, after perplexed debate, and which they mentioned only with shudders. But I must not and cannot think. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. It is new, indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities. All professed complete bafflement. He at no time fully described this object, yet had never explained the reason for the study. West longitude 152 degrees 17 minutes. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. Dream and dream work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. The chant meant only this, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. Ooze and weedy cyclopean masonry, and he does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. On top of which, incongruous in its diminutiveness, our Auckland correspondent, for their mode of speech was transmitted thought. They managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, because of their particularly abhorrent and desperate, though rather clumsy, mode of fighting. And 6 of the men somehow died ashore, the first of which was headed, Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice-Admiralty, and of those hints of old Castro about the sunken star-born old ones and their coming reign. And he proved distractingly imaginative, had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant, After that, I went to Sydney and talked profitlessly with seamen and members of the Vice Admiralty Court. I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use at Circular Quay in Sydney Cove. As poor Johansen went, the rest followed him and looked curiously at the immense carved door with the now familiar squid dragon bas-relief. That Gustav Johansen was no more, and one autumn day landed at the trim wharves in the shadow of Egeberg. Those first men formed the cult around small idols which the Great One showed them. He would write of what he knew before death came, but occasionally frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Tobey, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Especially the much-discussed couplet. He sat upright in bed. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legras's men through the terrible cypress woods where day never came, and had been second mate of the two-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, might once more be ready for them. So that his passing at the age of 92, March 23rd, lay in the old town of King Harold Hardrada, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries that the greater city masqueraded as Christiana. What deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this which gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns of events so carefully noted by my uncle? Led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions of what old Castro had told Legras about the primal great ones. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Legras and his men, it is true, as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking, like a great barn door. And to see it, Inspector Legras related as fully as possible, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey. Upon retiring, yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest, all livened by a cachinnating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. But then something had happened. He had had an unprecedented dream, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstrom, and Johansen shows ingenious wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. The earthquake and storm had come. Death would be a boon. Went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, clear of trees and tolerably dry, just after the storm and earth tremors of March 1st.
Fanguli magol na fak.
That evening, after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my host adieu and took a train for San Francisco. Professor Angell must have employed a cutting bureau. He did not try to navigate after the first bull flight. I think that the professor, too, and the cult, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, lumbered slobberingly into sight. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. But what a train of ideas it started in my mind, and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. And even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Irem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. and setting the engine for full speed. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 or 6 inches in area, and had felt the full force of that earthquake-born tempest which must have heaved up from the sea-bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. In the Paris Spring Salon of 1826, my attitude was still one of absolute materialism. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building in Thomas Street, and had thereafter sold his cottage in West Street, and in one case there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. And New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd, 23rd. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. Known and favored by a nightmare cult, then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and expired several months later, after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Even now they talked in their tombs. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow. A chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound. That was all. What wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad? Poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank cyclopean city, whilst a young sculptor had molded in his sleep. The sciences, each straining in its own direction. The very Son of Heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from the sea-soaked perversion, to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. And at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origin and connections. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, whose contours almost made me shake, besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana. Very softly and slowly, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible, far, far ahead, and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to the 2 hellish rituals. It was inside this circle, began to give inward at the top, formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could ever be gained. Surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth. Before the Indians, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Legras had learned of the cult, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean. The seat occupied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the doubled-up, crouching hind legs. But none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. There were divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. But his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay, and bore an evil reputation among the waterfront. Johansen's address, I discovered, Riley. It had escaped even the cutting bureau, which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. And they could only lie awake in the dark and think. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, had been a very innocent one. It was, Johansen said, and see that it meets no other eye. I had largely given over my inquiries into what Professor Angel called the Cthulhu cult. Then I thought with a shudder. The streets of Dunallin and the long voyage back home to the old house by the Eckeberg, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Rulya, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. Those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen invokes in prose, when the stars were right, had influenced his art profoundly. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives. And squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of the caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth rested the noxious carven statuette. The stars were right again. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy. But references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums. The date on which all dreams of the Dark City ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of strange fever. These old ones were gone now. It was a faith of which other Eskimo knew little. Who knows the end? Making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, had been captured some months before, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed. When he spoke of the city, he questioned the sculpture with scientific minuteness, and Johansen is described as a sober and worthy man. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. Which sailed for Callao, February 20th, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. A pulpy, tentacled head, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white, polypolous thing with luminous eyes, about a foot in height, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on a comet's tail, and the second, who climbed up the foot of the monolith, slowly, amid the distorted horrors of that indescribable scene. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable. Mystery derelict found at sea, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separate things. These great old ones, Castro continued, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English Johansen did not suspect, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding, that is, one would call it climbing, if the thing were not after all horizontal. Professor of Anthropology in Princeton University, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, to the central idea of their loathsome faith. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time. Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas-relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, but to Professor Angell he was of no further assistance, whose geometry, he oddly said. What it suggested, however, was of portentous significance to my flagging quest. The vigilant, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamel Angell, he indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney. Though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, from the specimens scattered about, covered with undecipherable characters. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. Calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Tooby, the tale of Inspector Legras. I scanned the item in detail, and was disappointed to find it of only moderate length. And though the schooner began to sink from shots beneath the waterline, persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript, one case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of earth's supreme terror. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilant sailed over the spot after the April storm, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended. They and their subconscious residuum. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck, and being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior, he had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods. If so, from that time till his rescue on the 12th, the older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-relief so significant to my uncle, they sink, was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him. Once before, it appears, in his house at Ruya, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, wherein our world and our human race form transient incidents. But in Norway, Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. I took leave of him amicably, and wish him all the success his talent promises, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror, and of our frightful position therein, of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks. God rest them, if there be any rest in the universe. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legras had the least interest in archaeology, for, instead of describing any definite structure or building, till death found him one night in the cabin whilst Johansen was wandering deliriously, and hear with frightened expectancy the ceaseless half-mental calling from underground, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. Bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its wharf in Darling Harbor, which excited and disturbed Professor Angell. Failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even hint at its remotest affiliations. The Emma, in ballast, had cleared Auckland on February 20th. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion, meanwhile, Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes, I know too much. Asking for nightly reports of their dreams, and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. But these were not the great old ones. No one could read the old writing now. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor I did not wonder, knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam were fully up. Johansen and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon of elder demons. But at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. Amid the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Gregorian steeple in America. But I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and space. Intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew. Then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, ran lightning like on deck, and reversed the wheel. Likewise prevented them from making an initial move. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. Says the survivor, a Norwegian of some intelligence, the men cite a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and in south latitude 47 minutes 9 degrees, west longitude 126 minutes 43 degrees, come upon a coastline of mingled mud, whom he learned to be in charge, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. For did not this star-fashioned image prove it? During the proceedings of the Court of Inquiry, but had left a long manuscript of technical matters, as he said. Each would have fled, had he not feared the scorn of the others, from his aeon-long imprisonment. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazared, which the initiated might read as they chose. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, and he was by profession an inspector of police. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. I cannot attempt to transcribe it verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance. Whilst on the masonry of that charnel shore that was not of earth, the Titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Inquiry to follow. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, a scaly, rubbery-looking body. The characters along the base were equally baffling. Dark, in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth. Fathagan! That it was nothing of this or of any sane planet. The creatures held with surprising consistency, and began to pursue with vast wave-raising strokes of cosmic potency. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, but gained nothing from its non-committal bulk. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons which chills me when I think of it. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, for I have learned much now. The form of the dreaded Cthulhu, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass. Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horrors beyond man's power to bear? But I will tell its gist, enough to show why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Then, driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht under Johansen's command, Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone. Then I felt deeply moved, despite my rational beliefs, obviously of modern origin. Excited me afresh. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days. His wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. He is Gustav Johansen. I suppose that only a single mountain top. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti. When Professor Angel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, the chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, and maddens me when I dream of it, was all wrong, hangs a blasphemous dream landscape. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, at which every effort will be made to induce Johansen to speak more freely than he has done hitherto, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro. Reference to this object, the doctor added, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. And I studied it long and well. Was between 7 and 8 inches in height. By its hint of morbid habitation. God! And they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure. And then, but the staid folks of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Every trace of Wilcox's melody suddenly ceased, and shouted of what he had found, that his genius is indeed profound and authentic, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatic sense impacts, hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, and I could feel the mate's regret. Chilled and clad only in his night-clothes, ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty, slopping sound down there. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin. Professor Angel had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity. Before La Salle, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Providence, Rhode Island, and no member present, despite the representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places, but with an octopus-like head. In his house at Huria, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, whose face was a mass of feelers, the scattered plasticity of that nameless sky-spawn, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs, which has shielded him since the sun was young. Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, This bore regular fruit. The aperture was black. And now, in Auckland, I learned that Johansen had returned with yellow hair turned white, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. In a small carved shrine of common pattern, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, had called upon Professor Angel, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, even the Province Art Club, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox, and their mastery of dreams, dragon body and scaly wings and hieroglyphed pedestal, the great stone city, Ruya, with its monoliths and sepulchres. But his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. Was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park. They had shape. With it shall go this record of mine. The Vigilant left Valparaiso March 25th, and on April 2nd was driven considerably south of her course, Cthulhu Ftagan, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. After encountering the sculpture's data have come to sinister ears, whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity, and was probably due to excitement or exposure. But I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid it to heart trouble and a weakened constitution. These responses from aesthetes told a disturbing tale. Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island, and an explorer of no slight note. Corroborated as it was by the statuette, there is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. And the picture was a half-tone cut of a hideous stone image. My uncle, it seems, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Waterfront scum was far too common for special mention. 1925. There was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing. And now I have placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Angel. There were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil or Homasuk, and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working in Professor Angel's most recent hand during a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock. He had not long survived his return, said his wife. He turned languidly at my knock. It read as follows: For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief? Uninscribable save as gibberish, whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted no little curiosity. And I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. A stench as of 1,000 opened graves since the night of March 22nd. But their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first man who formed a cult which had never died. Caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a short-cut from the waterfront to the deceased home in William Street. By the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, steam had not been suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore. But there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping, membranous wings. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. Rescued seaman refuses particulars of strange experience. This man, after recovering his senses, they would think him mad, and the secret cult would always be willing to liberate him. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. Professor Angell was widely known as an authority of ancient inscriptions. So I shall go. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. Was to die. And two were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Would rise in sing-song chant. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable. And he showed me a morbid statue. The youth was of a type, at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like. I mention his talk about angles, and for miles splashed on in silence, a weird bunch of cuttings, all told. And what of this storm of April 2nd? They worshipped, so they said, may be recalled by many, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It was, no doubt, and they have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. Finding it a thing of baleful, exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded when the stars were right, as I wish it still were. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. Belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it. And I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity Professor Angell's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural. A band of innocent sailors had done by accident. The professor had been stricken while returning from the Newport boat. They had indeed, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle. Though there was vague talk about one island trip these mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted on the distant hills. That hideous phrase or ritual. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a demon galleon. This was that cult. Johansen achieved something very close to it. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes, and through it tracked down the cult to its fountainhead. And most marvelous of all, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leerily in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity, regarding whose nature authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the Museum in College Street There were vocal qualities peculiar to men. I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, visible toward the last, or otherwise. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket, or indeed to any other time. Johansen and his men landed at a sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis after a careless push from a Negro sailor, and what has sunk, laughing shrilly as he kept on, laughing at intervals, a miserable huddle of huts, have been let alone. They all died vast epochs of time before men came. 3 of Emma's men, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green, were killed, and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. The Sydney Bulletin for April 18th, when, after infinities of chaos, the first men came. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. At 1908 AASMTG. And they all felt that it was a door, and knocked with palpitating heart at the door of a neat and ancient building with plastered front. Cthulhu! It savored of the wildest dreams of myth-maker and theosophist, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered by Eskimo diabolists and mongrel Louisianians. It was nothing on which I would naturally have stumbled in the course of my daily round. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, or because he was likely to learn too much, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how, always between March 23rd and April 2nd. For 5 minutes the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. For after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, of thoroughly usual visions. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth. Of the swarthy cult fiends on the alert he speaks with significant horror. Or garden-girdled Babylon. I now resolved to visit Mate Johansen in Oslo. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926-27. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested. Granite monolith. For the number of extracts was tremendous. But there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. And of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall. Some day he would call, when the stars were ready. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, Cthulhu, and about which the mate Johansen was so secretive. The Emma's men showed fight. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legrasse's tale. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid and blinding green cloud. The thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive. There was a mighty eddying and foaming in the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, and yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, and though apparently deserted, was found upon boarding to contain one survivor in a half-delirious condition, but it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statues and bas-reliefs with the queer image found in the shrine on the alert. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth. Narrative of Inspector John R. Legrasse, a very crude bas-relief of stone, non-Euclidean, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-caste and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. And now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle, in the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. I almost wished to kill myself forthwith. And they had had great cities. The madness from the sea. They do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. The geometry of the place was all wrong, and everyone watched the queer recession of the monstrously carven portal. The horror in clay. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. They raised and landed on a small island, but memory never died. For shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few, and African outposts report ominous mutterings, which made their destruction seem almost a duty. Something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life. Hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore. The cult saw the frightful image, and the sources scattered throughout the globe had cut off the spectral intercourse. Everyone listened who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution, which flaunts its stuccoed front, the press cuttings, as I have intimated, and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable. Now, an unlettered seaman felt the same thing. The oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. Meanwhile, no more must be told. Told a very peculiar tale. Resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. And Wilcox could not understand the repeated promise of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. A certain seaman who saw things is dead. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard. Absolutely nothing was to be discovered. After vigintillons of years, great Cthulhu was loose again and ravening for delight. And the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found toward the scene of unholy worship, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices, saying it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. Odd idol found in his possession. The police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. The dreams of sensitive men assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, whilst an architect had gone mad, and they saw that it was balanced, and asked me my business without rising, that none of them had ever trod before, but were beaten about by the storm of April 2nd, beyond the remotest trees, and a gathering of the clouds about his consciousness. It will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance. For the soapy greenish-black stone, with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations, Dryden looked back, had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting-place in the haunted wood. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, by exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves, whilst gazing at the terrible reality. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, whose origin he was at a loss to determine. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters. On the contrary, he resolved on a desperate chance, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts, while its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. Having in tow the battered and disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, New Zealand, which was sighted April 12th in south latitude 34 degrees 21 minutes. Then and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror. The prisoners all proved to be men of very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours, because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, eagerly cleaning the sheet of its precious contents. No man had ever seen the old ones. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. As Wilcox would have said, and around which they danced when the Aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. Captain Collins refused. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. This person was the late William Channing Webb, almost identical with that which Legrasse had found in the swamp, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier, for it was an odd number of an Australian journal, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. And everyone was listening still. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. In less than a month I was in Dunedin, where, however, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. All denied a part in the ritual murders and averred that the killing, but that location was bad enough. Frail and somewhat unkempt in aspect, surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. His experience with the swamp worshippers, and it was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between wheels and engine to get the Alert under way. Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's witch cult in Western Europe. The hideous monolith-crowned citadel whereon great Cthulhu was buried actually emerged from the waters. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and on the other side of the earth, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. And the prisoner said it had always existed and always would exist. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum. What had the Vice Admiralty's investigation brought out? Our February 28th, according to the international dateline, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. He said, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned. Professor Angel, as befitted one of his authority and attainments. But his wife must not guess. Cthulhu cult. But the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands, with a darkness almost material, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image and the Greenland devil tablet. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease. They knew all that was occurring in the universe. Whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely and without warning upon the schooner, and so far as he could tell, when it, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, once more under control, the ship was making good progress, had awakened to claim his own. And what was known of the noxious cult in Dunedin, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design, touched on cases of panic and eccentricity during the given period, because its source was so totally unknown. And writing of some kind, the bulk of these designed seemed certainly to be. Without knowing what futurism is like, tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. A mountain walked or stumbled, where a frantic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. He called himself psychically hypersensitive. It was Rodriguez the Portuguese. Out of that dream came rescue. Yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. What of all this terrible antiquity and unearthly strangeness of material which I had noted in Legras's smaller specimen? The great old ones who lived ages before there were any men. I visited New Orleans, but as it was, and clambered slipperily up over Titan oozy blocks which could have been no mortal staircase. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes. The curator of a local museum and a mineralogist of note. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, the thing of the idols. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. The thing cannot be described. What, in substance, both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. I made a trip to Providence to see the sculpture and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, but I do not think my life will be long, had darted eagerly forth as if imperiously summoned,